The night he walked away, the city looked perfect from 40 floors above the ground. Glass towers reflected one another like mirrors locked in competition, their lights shimmering as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong. From the outside, the penthouse looked like a dream. From the inside, it felt like a place where silence had learned how to hurt. Elena Carter stood in the middle of the living room, barefoot on cold marble, her arms folded tightly around herself as if she could physically keep her heart from breaking apart. The dress she wore, deep blue, elegant, expensive, was one he had bought for her just weeks ago, back when his eyes still softened when he looked at her. Back when he still spoke her name like it mattered. Across the room, Julian Blackwood didn't look at her. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of amber liquid clenched in his hand, staring out at the city he ruled. At 38, Julian Blackwood was everything the world admired. Self-made billionaire. Tech empire founder. Magazine covers called him visionary, relentless, unstoppable. He wore control like a second skin. Even now, even here, he looked composed, powerful, untouched. But Elena had learned that his silence was never calm. It was a locked door. "Say something," she finally whispered, her voice steady only because she had practiced this moment 100 times in her head. "Tell me you want this. Or tell me you never will. But stop treating me like I'm a child who doesn't deserve the truth." Her words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Julian didn't turn around. The seconds stretched painfully. Elena felt each one press against her chest. She recognized this pattern. He did this when conversations got too close to places he didn't want to go. He retreated inward, building walls so tall that even love couldn't climb them. "I'm not having this conversation tonight," he said at last, his voice low, controlled, professional. The same tone he used to shut down boardrooms. Elena swallowed. "It's never the night, Julian. It's never the time." She took a step closer, her heart pounding. "We've been married 3 years. 3. And every time I talk about the future, about having a family, you shut me out like I've asked you to destroy your life. That finally did it." Julian turned. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was worse. Distance. Cold calculation. The kind of stare that made people back down without him ever raising his voice. "I said I'm not discussing this," he replied, straightening his jacket like he was ending a meeting. "I need space." Elena laughed softly, brokenly. "You always need space. Time. Distance. Silence. Do you know what that feels like from my side?" Her voice cracked despite her efforts. "It feels like being married to someone who disappears whenever things get real." Julian's jaw tightened. His fingers curled around the glass. For a moment, Elena thought she saw something else beneath the control. Fear, maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You don't understand what you're asking of me," he said. "I'm asking you to be my husband," she replied, tears finally spilling over. "Not a ghost. Not a fortress. A man who stays when things get uncomfortable." The word struck harder than she intended. Julian took a sharp breath, then looked away again as if facing her would cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. "I need air," he muttered. Before Elena could stop him, he was already moving, keys in hand, stride decisive, escape already planned. "Julian, don't," she said, panic rising. "Please. Not like this. We can talk. We can." He didn't slow down. The front door closed with a sound that echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. Elena stood frozen, staring at the place where he had been, her body trembling as reality crashed in. Luxury surrounded her, artwork, designer furniture, a view people dreamed of, but she had never felt more alone. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. She closed her eyes. 2 weeks ago, in a bathroom flooded with morning light, she had stared at a small plastic stick until her legs gave out beneath her. 2 pink lines. Clear. Unmistakable. Her whole world had tilted in that moment, joy and fear colliding in her chest. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She had wanted to tell him perfectly. She had imagined his reaction 100 different ways. A quiet smile. Maybe fear, but followed by warmth. She had believed that this news would finally bring him closer. That it would anchor him. But each time she looked at him, saw that wall in his eyes, the words caught in her throat. Now he was gone. Elena sank onto the couch, hugging herself as sobs finally broke free. She cried for the baby growing inside her. She cried for the marriage that felt like it was slipping through her fingers. And she cried for the man she loved, the man who had everything except the courage to stay. Far below, Julian's black luxury car tore through the city streets, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his chest tight with something he refused to name. He told himself he needed space. He told himself he'd come back when things cooled down. What he didn't know, what would haunt him forever, was that he had just walked away from the most important moment of his life. The phone rang just after dawn. Julian was already awake, staring at the ceiling of a hotel room that felt too quiet, too empty. He had silenced his phone overnight, drowning his thoughts in exhaustion and avoidance. When the sound finally broke through, sharp and urgent, something in his chest twisted. "This is Dr. Hayes from Memorial Hospital," the voice on the other end said. "Mr. Blackwood, your wife has been admitted. You need to come immediately." Julian sat up. What happened? There was a pause, too long. "She suffered a medical emergency," the doctor continued carefully. "There were complications." Julian was already on his feet. "Is she okay?" Another pause. "Your wife experienced a miscarriage early this morning." The world tilted. Julian's phone slipped from his hand and hit the floor, the sound distant, unreal. His mind rejected the word entirely. Miscarriage? No, that didn't make sense. They weren't trying. Elena hadn't told him. She was 8 weeks pregnant, the doctor added softly. 8 weeks. The realization hit like a collapse from the inside out. Elena had been pregnant. While he had been pulling away. While he had been running. She was alone when it happened, the doctor said. Our staff found her collapsed. She tried to call someone. Julian didn't hear anything after that. He was already moving, already running, already drowning in the weight of what he had done. The cost of silence. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet despair. Everything was white, walls, floors, sheets, as if pain could be erased by cleanliness alone. Julian Blackwood moved through the corridors like a man walking toward his own judgment. His name opened doors. Doctors stepped aside. Nurses spoke gently. Privilege still worked. It always had. But none of it touched the weight crushing his chest. When he reached Elena's room, he stopped just outside the door. For the first time in his adult life, Julian hesitated. Boardrooms never frightened him. Billion-dollar risks never made his hands shake. But this door, this quiet room, held something he couldn't negotiate his way out of. He pushed it open slowly. Elena lay in the hospital bed, smaller than he had ever seen her. Pale, fragile. Tubes ran from her arm to machines that beeped softly, marking time she could never get back. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands falling across her face like she hadn't had the energy to fix them. She looked nothing like the confident woman who once stood beside him at galas, smiling for cameras. Julian's breath caught. He crossed the room carefully as if sudden movement might break her further, and sat beside her bed. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away, but she didn't hold on either. Her eyes remained fixed on the far wall, unfocused, distant. Elena, he whispered. I'm here. She didn't respond. I didn't know, he continued, his voice shaking now despite his efforts. If I had known, I would have. She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't crying. They were empty in a way that terrified him far more than rage ever could. That's the problem, she said quietly. You didn't know. Because you never stayed long enough to listen. The words landed softly, but they cut deeper than any accusation. Julian swallowed hard. I'm so sorry. I should have been here. I should have answered my phone. I should have. You should have wanted to be here, she interrupted, her voice calm but final. Not because of guilt. Not because of consequences. Because I mattered. Silence fell between them again. Outside the room, Julian's phone buzzed incessantly. Missed calls. Messages. His assistant. His board. Investors. News alerts. Somewhere out there, his empire was already noticing his absence. For the first time, he didn't care. Hours passed. Elena drifted in and out of sleep, exhaustion claiming her in waves. Julian didn't move. He watched her breathe. He replayed every moment of the night before, the way she had stood there asking for honesty, for reassurance for him, and how he had chosen to leave. Late that afternoon, a nurse entered quietly and spoke to Elena about discharge paperwork. Julian listened as if hearing someone else's life being discussed. You can go home tomorrow, the nurse said gently. Elena nodded once. Julian's heart lifted slightly. I'll make sure everything's ready, he said quickly. I'll stay with you. I'll take time off. She finally turned fully toward him. I want you gone by the time I leave, she said. The words hit harder than the doctor's phone call. What? Julian whispered. I need space, Elena replied. Real space. Not the kind you take when things get hard. The kind that lets me breathe. He stood up slowly, disbelief etched across his face. Elena, please. We shouldn't make decisions like this right now. I am, she said calmly. Because this didn't start last night. It ended last night. Julian felt something shift beneath his feet, something fundamental cracking. That evening news broke. At first it was whispers. A cancelled meeting. A delayed acquisition. Then a headline surfaced on a financial blog. Blackwood Technologies faces sudden internal review amid leadership absence. Julian barely noticed. What he didn't know was that while he sat beside a hospital bed, the machine he had built so carefully was beginning to turn without him, and not in his favor. By morning, Elena was discharged. Julian waited outside the hospital entrance as she stepped into the sunlight, her movements slow, guarded. Car was waiting, not his. Her sister's. Elena didn't look back as she got inside. Julian stood there, surrounded by noise and motion, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The next blow came before noon. His phone rang. This time it was his chief legal officer. Julian, the man said carefully, we have a situation. Julian closed his eyes. How bad? Bad enough that you need to come in. Now. When Julian arrived at headquarters, the atmosphere had changed. Conversation stopped when he passed. Eyes followed him, not with admiration but with uncertainty. Fear. Doubt. In the boardroom, faces stared back at him like strangers. We've received formal notice, the legal officer explained. A federal investigation into data practices we flagged years ago but never fully resolved. It's public. Julian's mind raced. That was handled. It wasn't, another board member replied. It was buried. Julian realized with chilling clarity what had happened. His absence, his silence had created an opening. And the consequences were arriving fast. Stock prices dropped within hours. Media outlets swarmed. And as Julian stood at the head of the table, watching everything he controlled begin to unravel, one truth burned through him with unbearable clarity. For the first time in his life, running had cost him more than staying ever could. When power begins to shift. By the end of the week, Julian Blackwood's face was everywhere. It stared out from financial news segments, splashed across business websites, dissected by commentators who had once praised his brilliance. Now they spoke in careful tones about misjudgments, ethical lapses, and a pattern of control culture. The empire he had built on precision and dominance was being questioned, not by enemies but by the very systems that had once protected him. Julian sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left, the city glowing beneath him as it always had. But tonight the view offered no comfort. It felt accusatory, like a million eyes watching him fall. He replayed Elena's words again and again. Because you never stayed long enough to listen. His phone vibrated with another alert. Shares down another 7%. A partner suspending collaboration. A board meeting scheduled without him present. Without him. For the first time since founding Blackwood Technologies, he wasn't at the center of things. Control was slipping through his fingers and no amount of money could force it back. Across the city, Elena sat at her sister's kitchen table, wrapped in a cardigan that smelled faintly of coffee and home. The apartment was small, cluttered, lived in, nothing like the penthouse she had left behind. But here the silence felt different. It wasn't cold. It didn't threaten to swallow her whole. Her sister moved quietly around her, offering tea, warmth, presence. No demands. No pressure. Just kindness. That was when Elena realized something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. She had been shrinking herself to fit into Julian's world. For years she had been introduced as Julian Blackwood's wife. Elegant. Supportive. Quiet. People rarely asked what she did, what she believed, what she wanted. And she had let that happen, thinking love meant compromise. But now, sitting in borrowed comfort with a heart still aching, she felt something else stir beneath the grief. Clarity. 3 days later, Elena received a call of her own. It came from a woman named Naomi Feld, an investigative journalist known for dismantling powerful men with uncomfortable truths. Elena had read her work before. Never imagined she would be part of it. I'm not calling about your husband, Naomi said gently. I'm calling about you. Elena hesitated. I don't want to be part of a spectacle. I understand, Naomi replied. But I believe your voice matters. And right now, people are only hearing his version of silence. The words settled heavily in Elena's chest. For the first time since the hospital, she didn't feel powerless. Meanwhile, Julian watched from his office as reporters gathered outside the building bearing his name. Security briefed him on protest signs forming, former employees speaking out, anonymous leaks surfacing. One headline cut deeper than the rest. Blackwood's culture of control. What silence cost the people closest to him? Julian slammed his laptop shut. He didn't know how it had happened so quickly. How the world had turned from reverence to scrutiny overnight. But deep down he knew the truth. This wasn't sudden. It was overdue. That night, he drove to Elena's sister's apartment. He stood outside the building for nearly 10 minutes before going in. When the door opened, Elena froze. She hadn't expected him to look like this. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes were hollow. The billionaire everyone feared looked like a man who had lost his footing. "I won't stay long," he said quietly. "I just needed to see you." Elena studied him for a long moment. "I'm listening," she said. "But I'm not bending." The word surprised them both. Julian nodded slowly. "I deserve that." For the first time he didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He didn't control the narrative. He simply stood there exposed. "I'm losing everything," he admitted. Elena's expression didn't change. "I already lost something," she replied softly. The realization hit him harder than any headline. This time when she closed the door, it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like consequence. The day the world watched him fall. The boardroom had never felt this quiet. Julian Blackwood sat at the long glass table where he had once commanded unquestioned authority. Every seat was filled, yet no one met his eyes. These were people who had followed him for years, executives, investors, partners who had built their fortunes alongside his. Now their loyalty had limits. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Julian," she began carefully, "this isn't personal. But the company cannot survive uncertainty at the top." He nodded slowly. For the first time he didn't argue. Didn't negotiate. Didn't intimidate. "I understand," he said. A vote followed. Formal. Procedural. Final. Julian Blackwood was removed as CEO of Blackwood Technologies effective immediately. News outlets broke the story within minutes. Stock prices stabilized, not because of him but because he was gone. That was the moment it truly sank in. His power had never been permanent. It had only existed as long as people believed in it. Across the city, Elena sat in a quiet studio with Naomi Feld, hands folded in her lap, a microphone clipped discreetly to her blouse. Her heart raced, not with fear but with resolve. She wasn't there to destroy Julian. She was there to tell the truth. "When people think of powerful men," Elena said calmly, looking straight into the camera, "they imagine strength, certainty, leadership. But power without vulnerability creates silence. And silence hurts the people closest to you first." The interview aired that evening. She spoke about emotional abandonment. About being present but unseen. About the cost of waiting for someone who keeps walking away. She never insulted Julian. Never raised her voice. That restraint made her words land harder. Viewers listened. For the first time, Elena wasn't the billionaire's wife. She was a woman reclaiming her voice. Julian watched the interview alone in his apartment, the penthouse now emptied of warmth and meaning. He didn't look away. He let every word reach him. Every truth settle where denial once lived. He didn't feel anger. He felt exposed. The next morning, Julian did something no one expected. He stepped in front of cameras, not to defend himself but to apologize. "I built my career by believing control was strength," he said, standing without notes, without a script. "I was wrong. I failed as a leader because I failed as a human being first." The admission stunned the media. Some called it strategic. Others called it overdue. But Elena knew the difference. Because this time, Julian wasn't running. He resigned completely that day. Walked away from the empire he once used as armor. The fallout continued. Lawsuits, restructuring, reputational loss. But something else began quietly in its place. Change. Weeks passed. Elena returned to her work, something she had once pushed aside for Julian's world. She began speaking privately with women who had lived similar silences. She wasn't chasing attention. She was building meaning. One afternoon she received a message. It was from Julian. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," it read. "I'm learning how to listen. I just wanted you to know." She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she set the phone down. Some journeys didn't require a response. What remains after everything is lost. Time did not heal everything. But it changed the shape of the pain. Months passed and the world moved on the way it always does, quickly, relentlessly, without waiting for anyone to catch their breath. Blackwood Technologies rebranded. New leadership stepped in. Headlines shifted to other scandals, other fallen giants. Julian Blackwood's name slowly disappeared from the daily news cycle. But inside him, nothing felt quiet. He rented a modest apartment far from the skyline he once ruled. No glass walls. No private elevators. No staff. Just space and silence that no longer felt like safety. For the first time in his life, Julian woke up without a schedule written for him by power. No meetings. No leverage. No illusion of control. The emptiness forced him to confront something he had avoided for decades. Himself. He started therapy reluctantly at first, then desperately. Sessions were brutal. Honest. Stripped of performance. He spoke about his father, the violence, the fear, the belief that love was something you survived, not something you trusted. He spoke about how control had felt safer than connection. How silence had been his armor. And how that armor had cost him everything that mattered. Meanwhile, Elena's life took a direction no one had predicted, not even her. She didn't return to the penthouse. She didn't ask for settlements or interviews or sympathy. Instead, she enrolled in a certification program she had once postponed for years. Counseling. Advocacy. Trauma-informed care. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted to be useful. She began volunteering at a women's center quietly, sitting in small rooms with people who spoke in whispers the way she once had. Women who had learned to disappear inside relationships that looked perfect from the outside. When Elena listened, she didn't interrupt. She stayed. That was the difference. One evening, months later, Elena stood in front of a small audience at a community center. No cameras. No spotlight. Just rows of folding chairs and faces full of cautious hope. "I used to believe love meant patience," she said gently. "And patience is important. But I learned the hard way that patience without presence becomes self-erasure." The room was silent. "You don't need to be loud to deserve honesty," she continued. "You don't need to beg to be chosen. And you don't need someone else's healing to put your life on hold." Some people cried. Others nodded. Elena felt something settle inside her that night. Not happiness. Something deeper. Julian watched none of this. He didn't follow her work. Didn't read articles about her. He understood now that growth didn't come with an audience, and neither did accountability. The only message he ever sent her remained unanswered. He respected that. Because respect finally meant restraint. A year after the night everything fell apart, Julian visited the hospital again. Not as a husband. Not as a billionaire. Just a man standing in a quiet hallway, holding flowers he wouldn't leave. He didn't go inside. He stood there long enough to remember what he had lost, not to punish himself but to honor it. Then he walked away. Across town, Elena woke up that same morning to sunlight streaming through her window. She brewed coffee, opened her laptop, prepared notes for a session she would lead later that day. She paused briefly, placing a hand over her heart, not in pain but in acknowledgement. She had survived something that once threatened to break her. And she had become more than what anyone, including herself, had once believed she could be. Somewhere in the city, two lives continued forward on separate paths. One built on humility learned too late. The other built on strength reclaimed just in time. Justice didn't arrive as revenge. It arrived as truth.